The day had begun, like so many others, quiet, steady, and unremarkable. The kind of day where the clock seems to tick louder than usual. And you notice the creaks in the house you've long grown accustomed to? I was sitting in my favorite chair by the window, knitting a sweater for no one in particular. I often knit simply because it gave my hands something to do while my mind wandered. Outside, the world looked muted. A soft autumn light spilled across the yard, brushing the fallen leaves with shades of gold and rust. It had been weeks since I'd seen my grandson, and months since we'd shared a proper conversation. Our lives had drifted into that familiar rhythm. I would wait for his calls, and he would squeeze them into his busy schedule whenever he could. He was in college now, balancing studies, friends, responsibilities that often left him sounding distracted and tired on the phone. Still, his voice always carried warmth, and I cherished every word, even if it lasted only 5 minutes. So when a firm knock rattled my front door that Thursday afternoon, I wasn't expecting much. Probably the postman with a delivery, or perhaps a neighbor needing sugar or help with their fence again. But as I rose from my chair, smoothing the wrinkles in my cardigan, something about that knock felt purposeful. Stronger than the hurried tap of a Deliveroo man, it's not tentative like a neighbor. I opened the door. There he was, my grandson. I froze for a second, as if my eyes were playing tricks on me. He stood there with his backpack slung over one shoulder, a small rolling suitcase at his side, and the brightest grin I'd seen on him in years. His hair was tousled, his jacket slightly wrinkled, and there was a mischievous glimmer in his eyes that reminded me so much of the little boy who used to run circles around my kitchen table. "Grandma," he said, almost shouting with excitement. For a moment, my breath caught in my throat. My hands gripped the doorknob tighter, not from weakness, but from sheer disbelief. He hadn't mentioned a visit. Not a word, not even a hint. Our last phone call had been brief, him telling me about a big exam and some project that was eating up his time. Nothing about a trip. And yet here he was, standing in the doorway, looking as though he had arrived from another world. "Good heavens, child," I gasped, my voice cracking with surprise. "What are you doing here?" He laughed, that warm, full laugh I had missed so much. "I thought I'd surprise you." Surprise me? That was an understatement. My heart was racing like a drum, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. How had he gotten here? Was he all right? Had something happened? But all I could do was pull him into my arms. The moment I felt his shoulders against mine, I realized just how long it had been since I'd hugged him. "Too long? You didn't tell me you were coming?" I scolded gently, so I couldn't keep the smile off my face. "That's the point," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I wanted to see your face when I showed up." And oh, he had succeeded. My face, my heart, my whole being was lit up in a way I hadn't felt in years. I ushered him inside, the old floorboards creaking under the weight of his suitcase as he rolled it across the hall. The house suddenly felt different, brighter, fuller, more alive. As he dropped his things near the stairs, I noticed something in his demeanor. He was excited, yes, but there was a depth to his expression, a seriousness hiding behind that easy grin. His eyes flickered around the room as if he were searching for something, or maybe gathering courage. I didn't press him, not yet. Instead, I busied myself with the usual grandmotherly instincts. "You must be starving after such a trip. Did you eat? Sit down. Let me get you something, Grandma." "I'm fine," he said, chuckling as he flopped onto the couch. "You don't have to fuss." But of course I fussed anyway. I warmed leftovers, set out cookies, poured him a glass of milk. It was my way of grounding myself, of convincing my heart that this moment was real. Every time I glanced over at him, sitting there with his familiar half-smile, I marveled at how grown he looked now. He had broader shoulders, a more confident air, and yet, in small gestures, the way he ran his fingers through his hair or tapped his foot when impatient, he was still my little boy. When I finally sat beside him, the warmth of his presence filled the space between us. "Now tell me," I said, still shaking my head in disbelief, "why on earth did you come without a word?" He leaned back, stretching his arms. "Because I needed to, Grandma. I just needed to be here." Those words struck me. Needed to be here. Not wanted to, not had free time, but but needed. A dozen possibilities flashed in my mind: trouble at school, conflict with friends, heartbreak, or perhaps something more serious. But his voice carried no heaviness, only a quiet certainty. I looked at him closely, searching his face for clues. His eyes, though bright, carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It was as if he was holding on to a secret, something he hadn't yet decided how to share. "Well," I said softly, patting his hand, "you know this house is always your home. You don't need a reason to come back." He smiled. But the shadow in his expression lingered. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the windows with amber light, we sat together in the living room. He told me little stories from his college life, professors he admired, friends who made him laugh, even a class he was struggling with. I listened intently, nodding, laughing, offering advice where I could. Yet through it all I felt that undercurrent of something unspoken. I didn't push him. I knew my grandson well enough to understand that he would tell me when he was ready. But deep inside, I sensed that his sudden visit was not simply about surprising me or escaping routine. Something larger was at play, something that would unfold in time. As night fell, and I tucked an extra blanket over him on the couch because of course he insisted on sleeping there rather than in the guest room, I stood for a long moment watching him. His chest rose and fell in steady breaths, his face peaceful in the glow of the lamp. I whispered to myself, "What brought you here, my dear boy?" Little did I know, the answer would change everything I thought I knew about our family, and about the quiet life I had grown so used to. His arrival was not just unexpected. It was the beginning of something I could never have imagined, something that, even now, still feels unreal. The next morning, I awoke earlier than usual. Maybe it was the excitement of having my grandson under my roof again. Or maybe it was that grandmotherly instinct that never truly rests. I tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to wake him. He was still sprawled out on the couch, the blanket I'd tucked over him, half kicked onto the floor. His hair stuck up at odd angles, his mouth slightly open, and in that moment, I didn't see the young man he'd become, but the little boy who used to fall asleep clutching his toy truck after a day of running wild in the yard. I made breakfast the way I always used to when he was younger. Scrambled eggs with a touch of cream to make them fluffy, thick toast with butter and jam, and crispy fried potatoes. The scent filled the kitchen, and sure enough, by the time I plated everything, he shuffled in. Rubbing his eyes, "Grandma," he groaned, sniffing the air. "You're going to spoil me. That's the plan," I replied with a grin. "Sit down before it gets cold." We ate together, and it felt so natural, so right, as if no time had passed since the days he'd stay with me during summer vacations. He told me about a few of his classes, some fascinating, others, in his words, absolute torture. He spoke of new friends he'd made, professors who were strict but fair, and a roommate who couldn't seem to stop playing loud music at night. I laughed along, enjoying the lightheartedness of it all. Yet even as he talked, there was a flicker in his expression, like he was skimming the surface, keeping something just beneath. After breakfast, I suggested a walk. The weather was crisp, the kind of autumn air that makes you want to breathe deeply and hold it inside. We wandered down the familiar path toward the park, leaves crunching underfoot. He walked beside me, hands shoved in his pockets, gaze darting here and there. He seemed restless, as though his mind was elsewhere. "You're quiet," I finally said. Breaking the silence, he glanced at me, his lips twitching into a half-smile. "Just thinking. About what?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Life, I guess." It wasn't like him to be so vague. My grandson had always been open, chatty even, especially with me, but I didn't press. I had learned over the years that pushing only made him retreat further into himself. Instead, I let the conversation drift back to lighter topics, the smell of wood smoke in the air, the memories of when he used to feed ducks at the pond, the way the leaves looked like fires scattered across the ground by the time we returned home. The day had stretched into a golden afternoon. I busied myself in the kitchen preparing his favorite stew for dinner. He hovered around, occasionally helping chop vegetables, though he was more of a distraction than an assistant. Every so often I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of affection and hesitation. Finally, after dinner, as the dishes were stacked and the kitchen was quiet, he spoke. "Grandma," he said carefully, "can we go to the attic tomorrow?" I blinked, taken aback. The attic. Yeah, I want to look through some of the old things. Family stuff. The attic was not a place we frequented often. It was dusty, cluttered with decades of keepsakes. Boxes of clothes no one wore anymore, toys from my children's youth, and bundles of photographs I hadn't touched in years. The attic had always felt like another world. Even when I was a young mother, I rarely climbed those narrow stairs except to store away things I couldn't bear to part with but didn't want to see every day. Boxes of school projects, old holiday decorations, forgotten furniture, photo albums, every piece carried a memory. But as my grandson and I began opening lids and rummaging through the clutter, I could tell this visit was different. He wasn't just curious. He was searching. We had already unearthed treasures that made us laugh. A broken toy robot that once made enough noise to drive me half mad. A box of his father's high school report cards with teachers' comments, like bright but easily distracted. And even a stack of my old recipe books with notes scribbled in the margins. Every discovery made him grin, but I noticed his eyes always wandered toward the farthest corner of the attic, where the oldest, dustiest boxes sat, untouched for years. "Grandma," he said quietly, almost as though he didn't want to break the spell of the place. "What's in that chest?" I followed his gaze. The chest he meant was an old wooden trunk, darkened with age, its brass hinges tarnished and its lock rusted. It had belonged to my late husband, his grandfather. I hadn't opened it in decades. Just seeing it sent a shiver through me, not from fear, but from the heavy pull of memory. Double quotes. "Oh, that old thing," I muttered, brushing my hands against my apron as though dusting off invisible dirt. "It's just your grandfather's keepsakes. Nothing you'd find exciting." But he wasn't convinced. "Can we open it?" For a moment, I hesitated. My instinct was to say no, to steer him back toward the lighter boxes filled with photo albums and toys. But the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. Something in him was reaching for answers, and somehow I sensed that chest held the key. "Bring it into the light," I said softly. Together, we dragged it toward the window. The wood creaked under our hands, and when he lifted the lid, a puff of dust swirled into the sunlight. Inside were layers of neatly folded items, an old military jacket, yellowed maps, a pair of glasses with cracked frames. Beneath those lay bundles of envelopes, tied with ribbon. My grandson froze. "Letters," he whispered. I felt my throat tighten. I knew instantly what they were. Letters my husband had written during his younger days. Before he and I were married, some even during the early years of our life together. Letters full of dreams, fears, and things he had never quite said aloud. My grandson picked one up carefully, as though it might crumble in his hands. The ink had faded, the paper browned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His grandfather's strong, looping script. He looked at me with wide eyes, silently asking for permission. I nodded. He untied the ribbon, pulled one free, and began to read aloud. "October 12th, 1965. My dearest." His voice faltered. He glanced at me. "It's addressed to you." I leaned against an old trunk, my knees suddenly weak. I remembered those letters, not all of them, but enough to know what they contained. Hopes he had shared with me, doubts he had confessed only in ink. Dreams of a future that sometimes frightened him with its uncertainty. "Go on," I whispered. So he did. He read letter after letter, his voice soft and reverent, sometimes pausing when the words grew too heavy. My husband had poured his soul into those pages. He wrote about his struggles as a young man trying to provide, about the pressure he felt to be strong when he often felt anything but. He wrote about love not just for me, but for the family he hoped to build. And he wrote about regrets, choices he wished he'd made differently, opportunities lost, mistakes that haunted him. At one point, my grandson stopped reading and looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Grandma, I never knew he felt like this. Dad never talks about him this way. To me, Grandpa was always just strong, stoic. I didn't know he doubted himself. I reached out, resting my hand over his. Your grandfather was many things, my dear. Brave, yes, strong, but he was also human. And sometimes, the parts we don't talk about are the ones that matter most. He nodded, swallowing hard, and kept reading. Hours passed like minutes. We sat cross-legged on the attic floor, surrounded by letters that seemed to breathe life into the room. Through them, my grandson met a version of his grandfather he had never known. Vulnerable, tender, uncertain. He laughed at the playful notes where his grandfather teased me about my terrible handwriting. He grew quiet at the passages where his grandfather spoke of fear during times of financial hardship. And once, he had to stop altogether when he came across a line that read, "If someday I cannot be there to guide them. I hope my children and their children will find these words and know that I loved them." Even when I failed to show it perfectly, my grandson lowered the page, his hands trembling. It's like he was writing to me, to us. Across time, tears blurred my vision, but I nodded. Perhaps he was. The attic no longer felt dusty or cluttered. It felt alive, humming with the voice of a man who had been gone for years, but was suddenly present again, speaking through every line of ink. When the sunlight began to fade, and the shadows stretched long, my grandson set the last letter down carefully. His eyes shone, but there was a solemnity in his face I had never seen before. "Grandma," he said softly, "why didn't anyone ever tell me about these?" I sighed, the weight of years pressing against my chest. "Because sometimes, child, the past feels too heavy to carry forward. We live, we grieve, and we choose what to remember. I thought keeping them tucked away was the kindest choice. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe these words were always meant to be found." He shook his head gently. "No, not wrong. Just waiting for the right time." We sat in silence for a while. The attic filled only with the sound of the wind rattling the window pane. For the first time I saw my grandson not as a boy or even as a young man, but as a bridge, a living link between the past and the future. As we gathered the letters back into the chest, I felt a shift in the air, as though something long buried had finally been released. My grandson looked at me, his face flushed with emotion. I think I understand him now," he said. "And maybe I understand myself a little better too." In that moment, I realized that his unexpected visit was never about escape or whim. It was about destiny. He had come, perhaps unknowingly, to uncover the truths waiting in that attic. Truths that had been silent for decades but still held the power to change how we saw ourselves, each other. And though my heart ached with the weight of memory, it also swelled with gratitude. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone in carrying the pod that night. After we closed the attic door and descended the creaky stairs, the house no longer felt the same. It was as if those letters had reshaped the very air we breathed. My grandson walked behind me slowly, his hand brushing the wooden railing, his eyes still distant, filled with the weight of what we had uncovered. Dinner that evening was quiet. Normally he was quick to chatter, filling silences with stories and jokes. But now, the silence was heavier, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful, as though his mind was turning over each word his grandfather had written. I busied myself with serving stew and bread, though I barely tasted it. I watched him instead, the way his brow furrowed as he chewed absent-mindedly, the way he occasionally glanced at me as if searching for reassurance that everything was all right. Finally, when the dishes were cleared and the lamps glowed softly against the walls, he spoke. "Grandma," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I think I know why I came here." I folded my hands in my lap and waited. "I've been lost," he admitted. "I didn't tell you over the phone, but I've been struggling at school. Not just with classes, but with everything. I keep asking myself what I'm supposed to do, who I'm supposed to be. And I felt like if I stayed there, I'd just drown in it. I didn't even plan this trip, not really. One morning, I just woke up, packed my bag, and came here. I didn't even know what I was looking for. But now I think I do." My heart ached as I listened, torn between wanting to comfort him and marveling at the strange, almost fated chain of events. "And what do you think you've found?" I asked gently. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes shining with unshed tears. A connection. To him, to you, to something bigger than me. Reading those letters, it felt like Grandpa was speaking directly to me, telling me it's okay to be scared, to not have all the answers, telling me that love and family matter more than perfection. I don't know how to explain it, Grandma, but it feels unreal. I reached across the table and took his hand. His palm was warm, trembling slightly. It feels unreal to me too, I said softly. As if he called you here, as if he knew you'd need his words. Even after all these years, we sat there, hands clasped. Both of us swept into that quiet current of understanding later. As the night deepened, he asked if we could read more. So we carried the letters down from the attic, one bundle at a time, spread them across the living room floor like a patchwork quilt of memory. Candlelight flickered against the pages as we read in turns, laughing at his grandfather's youthful exaggerations, pausing at his tender confessions, sometimes falling into silence when the words struck too close to the heart. At one point, my grandson picked up a letter and held it against his chest. "It's like he's still here," he whispered. I nodded, tears blurring my vision. "In a way he is. As long as his words live, so does he."